Beloved child, do not scroll past this moment as though it is ordinary, because something has been unfolding quietly behind the scenes, and the person your heart keeps returning to may soon receive information that causes them to look at their life, their emotions, and even your connection differently. Stay here for a little while, because what you are about to hear is not meant to frighten you, and it is not a prediction of illness or a promise about any medical outcome. This is a fictional spiritual story about what can happen when uncertainty forces a person to become honest with themselves. Somewhere in the silence surrounding your soulmate, there has been a question they have avoided, an emotion they have buried, and a truth they have repeatedly postponed. Now a medical report is on the way, and while the report itself belongs to doctors, facts, and real-world care, the waiting has already awakened something inside their heart that no laboratory can measure. The moment they realized they would have to wait for answers, their thoughts did not travel first toward possessions, schedules, unfinished work, or the opinions of strangers. Their thoughts traveled toward you. There is a reason that matters more than you may realize. When life feels predictable, people become skilled at postponing truth. They tell themselves they will speak tomorrow. They will apologize later. They will admit what they feel when the timing becomes easier. They will send the message when they feel braver. They will stop pretending when they finally know exactly what to say. But sometimes uncertainty enters a life and suddenly tomorrow no longer feels like an unlimited promise. That is what has happened emotionally around this person. Something as simple as waiting for a report has made them confront how much of their heart they have left unfinished. And the unfinished place that became impossible to ignore was the place where your name has been resting. They tried to distract themselves. They looked at their phone without really seeing what was on the screen. They moved through ordinary conversations while their mind remained somewhere else. They told people around them that everything was fine because they did not want anyone asking questions they were not prepared to answer. Yet in the private space where performance disappears, one thought kept returning with uncomfortable clarity: why have I waited so long to be honest? Notice what that question reveals. They were not only thinking about a report. They were thinking about time. They were thinking about regret. They were thinking about the possibility that fear has been making decisions their heart never agreed with. And every time that thought surfaced, so did you. You may have believed their silence meant indifference. You may have wondered whether the distance between you had erased what once felt meaningful. You may have looked at the lack of visible movement and concluded that nothing was happening beneath the surface. But people can be deeply affected by something while appearing completely still. Your soulmate has been carrying more internal conversation than you have been able to see. There are words they imagined saying to you and then swallowed. There are moments when they almost reached out and stopped themselves. There are memories they revisited late at night because those memories represented a version of themselves that felt more emotionally alive. The waiting surrounding this report has not created those feelings. It has exposed them. And there is something else. Recently, someone close to this person noticed the change before they admitted it themselves. The conversation began casually. A simple question was asked: what is really bothering you? Your soulmate gave the easy answer first. They spoke about stress. They spoke about uncertainty. They spoke about waiting. But the person listening knew there was another layer. So they asked again, more quietly this time, "Is this only about the report?" And that question changed the atmosphere. There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause that appears when a person realizes they have been seen more clearly than they intended. Your soulmate looked away. Their expression changed. The confidence they had been using to protect themselves disappeared for just a moment. Then they said something that surprised the person sitting near them. They admitted that waiting for answers had forced them to think about the people who truly mattered. They admitted that one person kept entering their mind again and again. They did not say it dramatically. They did not turn it into a grand confession. They simply spoke your place in their heart more honestly than they had allowed themselves to do before. And once the words were spoken aloud, they could no longer pretend that the connection meant nothing. The person listening asked, "Then why are you still distant?" That question landed differently. Your soulmate had explanations ready, but none of them sounded convincing anymore. Timing. Fear. Confusion. Pride. Circumstances. Misunderstandings. The possibility of rejection. The fear that too much had happened already. Every reason they had once considered powerful suddenly sounded smaller when spoken beside the possibility of regret. That was when something shifted. Not because they suddenly understood the future, but because they understood themselves. My child, there are moments when a person discovers that the greatest risk was never loving someone. The greatest risk was allowing fear to make every meaningful decision. Your soulmate is beginning to see that. The report has not arrived yet, and no one should invent what it will say. But emotionally, the waiting has already delivered another kind of result. It has revealed the difference between what they have been pretending to value and what they actually value when everything becomes quiet. They began remembering details about you that they had convinced themselves were forgotten. A certain expression on your face when you were trying not to show emotion. The way your presence could make an ordinary moment feel strangely significant. A conversation that ended too early. A sentence they wished they had answered differently. A time you showed care when they were too guarded to receive it properly. These memories did not arrive like random nostalgia. They arrived with a question attached: what if I never say what I should have said? That question frightened them more than the uncertainty they were already facing. Yet this is where the story becomes more mysterious, because while they were experiencing this internal awakening, you may have been feeling an unexplained emotional pull of your own. Perhaps their name crossed your mind unexpectedly. Perhaps an old memory surfaced for no obvious reason. Perhaps you felt tempted to revisit something you had been trying to release. In this fictional spiritual story, these moments do not have to be treated as supernatural proof of anything. Sometimes emotional connections leave deep impressions, and silence can make those impressions louder. What matters is that two people can reach a similar emotional crossroads from opposite sides without knowing it. Your soulmate has reached one now. There is a truth they have resisted because accepting it would require action. It is easier to miss someone privately than to communicate honestly. It is easier to wonder what might happen than to risk discovering what is real. It is easier to tell yourself a connection was complicated than to admit that fear influenced the outcome. But uncertainty has begun stripping away those comfortable explanations, one by one. The person who spoke with them asked another question. If you had one chance to say what you have never said, what would you tell them? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. Their eyes lowered. Their hands became still. And for the first time in that conversation, they seemed less concerned with protecting their image. Then they admitted something simple but powerful. They said they would want you to know that the distance never meant you were forgotten. But that was not the complete answer. There was more they wanted to say, and the person beside them could sense it. So they waited. They did not interrupt. They allowed silence to do what questions could not. Eventually your soulmate continued. They said that you had affected them in ways they never properly explained. They admitted that after knowing you, certain connections felt different. Certain conversations felt emptier. Certain environments reminded them of what genuine emotional presence had once felt like. They said they tried to move forward as though nothing significant had happened, but part of them kept measuring new experiences against something they had not resolved with you. And then came the sentence that surprised even them. They said, "I think I was waiting for the perfect moment because I was afraid the real moment would require courage." That is the sentence that changed everything. Because once a person identifies the true reason for their silence, they lose the comfort of pretending they are only waiting on circumstances. Your soulmate began seeing how often they had blamed timing for what was really fear. They remembered the message they typed and deleted. The conversation they almost started. The night they considered telling you the truth but decided to wait. The moment someone asked about you and they pretended your name meant less than it did. Every one of those memories began assembling into a pattern. The pattern was not that your connection had disappeared, the pattern was that they had been afraid of its importance. Now listen carefully, because this is where the medical report becomes symbolic within this story. Human beings often believe they need certainty before they can live honestly. They want guarantees. They want perfect timing. They want reassurance that vulnerability will be rewarded before they risk vulnerability. But life rarely offers those guarantees. A pending medical report can remind someone how little control they actually possess over tomorrow. It can also remind them that some things can still be chosen today: honesty, compassion, forgiveness, courage, presence. Your soulmate cannot control every result that reaches them. But they can control whether fear continues speaking on behalf of their heart. And that realization has been growing. There was a moment after that conversation when they were finally alone. Their phone was nearby. Your name was not on the screen, but it was in their mind. They unlocked the phone, opened a familiar place, and stopped. Their thumb hovered. For a few seconds, they came closer to reaching out than they had in a long time. But something held them back. Not lack of feeling. Not another person. Not indifference. It was the fear that after so much silence, they no longer knew how to begin. So instead of sending the message, they began writing something privately. Perhaps it was in their notes. Perhaps it was a draft. Perhaps it was only words arranged inside their mind. But the first sentence was different from anything they had allowed themselves to say before. It was not polished. It was not dramatic. It was honest. "I should have told you sooner." They stared at that sentence. Then they added another. "I thought distance would make this easier." But it had not. That realization became the emotional center of everything. The more they tried to step away from what they felt, the more clearly they understood what had mattered. Distance did not erase the connection, it revealed which parts of it were rooted deeper than temporary emotion. Silence did not remove your significance. It forced them to encounter it without distraction. And now, with this report on the way, they were confronting the uncomfortable possibility that waiting forever is not wisdom. Sometimes waiting is fear wearing the clothing of patience. Still, there is something you must understand. This message is not telling you to chase anyone, ignore boundaries, or build your life around a prediction. Your peace matters. Your dignity matters. Real love should never require you to abandon yourself. The mystery here is not about proving that another person's report somehow guarantees a romantic outcome. The deeper revelation is what uncertainty can awaken inside a human heart. Your soulmate may be discovering their truth, but you are also being invited to discover yours. Ask yourself what you have learned through this connection. Not merely what you hope will happen. What has it shown you about the way you love? What has it revealed about the kind of communication you need? What did the silence teach you about your boundaries? What did the longing reveal about the tenderness you still carry? Sometimes the purpose of a powerful connection is not only reunion. Sometimes it is transformation first. And something has transformed inside this person. The shift became undeniable when the person they had spoken with earlier contacted them again. This time the conversation was shorter. There were no long explanations. Just one question: are you going to tell them? Your soulmate stared at those words longer than they expected. Then something unusual happened. Instead of immediately finding another excuse, they answered, "I think I have to." The words were simple, but their meaning was enormous. For months, perhaps longer, they had been asking whether they should speak. Now they were beginning to ask how. The question had changed. And when the question changes, movement often follows. They started considering what honesty would actually require. An apology? A confession? An explanation? An acknowledgement that they had been emotionally inconsistent? They knew they could not arrive with vague words and expect everything to repair itself instantly. Something real would require humility. They would have to accept that you may have changed while they were silent. They would have to understand that your heart is not a waiting room they can enter whenever they finally become ready. That realization did not push them away. It made them more serious. Because genuine feeling becomes different when a person begins respecting the other person's freedom. They no longer wanted only relief from their own emotions. They wanted the possibility of truth between you, even if truth required patience. They wanted to know whether the connection they had spent so long avoiding still had a living place in reality, not merely memory. And then the notification came. Not the final medical report. Something else. A message connected to the appointment. A reminder that the result would soon be available. The moment they saw it, their stomach tightened. They placed the phone down, walked away, then returned. Suddenly every unfinished conversation felt louder. Their mind returned again to the private draft where your name sat beneath words they still had not sent. They opened it. Read the first line. I should have told you sooner. They deleted it. For 1 second, it looked as though fear had won again. But then they began typing from the beginning. This time the words were different. They were not written from panic. They were not written as though something terrible was guaranteed. They were written from clarity. They began by telling you something they should have admitted long ago, that your presence had mattered. Then they acknowledged the distance without pretending it had been easy for either side. Then they wrote something about the waiting they were experiencing now, not to pressure you, but because it had made them understand something about themselves. They wrote that life can become very loud until one uncertain moment makes everything suddenly quiet. And in that quiet, they heard your name. They stopped typing again. Their eyes filled, not with dramatic despair, but with the emotion of someone seeing their own truth without defenses. There was one final thing they wanted to add. Something they had never said to anyone clearly. Something about the exact reason your connection had frightened them from the beginning. Their fingers rested above the screen. Before they could type it, another notification appeared. This one was different. The report had become available. For several seconds they did not open it. They looked at the unfinished message to you. Then at the medical notification. Then back at your name. 2 truths were waiting in front of them. One about their health that belonged to medical reality, and one about their heart that they had been avoiding for far too long. They knew they needed to face both. But what happened next is where everything in this story begins to turn, because before they opened the report, before they finished the message, and before anyone around them knew what they were about to do, your soulmate whispered a sentence into the silence that revealed the deepest reason they had been running from you all along. And that sentence was not what anyone would have expected. The sentence left their lips so quietly that no one else could have heard it, yet inside them it sounded louder than everything they had been thinking for weeks. I was never afraid that I didn't love them enough. I was afraid that I loved them enough to change everything. And there it was. The truth they had disguised as confusion. The truth they had hidden beneath timing, distance, hesitation, pride, and unanswered questions. Your soulmate had not been running because the connection felt empty. They had been running because somewhere deep inside, it felt powerful enough to challenge the life they had learned to control. For several moments, they simply stared at the 2 things waiting on the screen, the notification telling them that their medical report was available and the unfinished message containing words they had never dared send to you. One represented information that required facts, doctors, and responsible interpretation. The other represented an emotional truth no medical test could measure. And strangely, it was the second one that made their hands tremble more. They understood that whatever the report contained, they would deal with it properly. But the unfinished message was confronting something different, how long they had allowed fear to decide what you deserved to know. They opened the medical report. Their eyes moved slowly across words they did not immediately understand. Numbers. Medical terminology. References that required professional explanation rather than imagination. They refused to jump to conclusions. They knew the responsible thing was to discuss anything unclear with a qualified medical professional. Yet as they looked at the page, another realization entered their heart with extraordinary force. For all the things human beings can measure, there are other parts of life that cannot be reduced to a number. No report could calculate how many times they had remembered you. No test could measure the weight of an apology they had carried but never delivered. No scan could show the exact place where a memory of your voice still lived inside them. No laboratory could determine whether two people should reunite, whether love should be pursued, or what the future would become. Those answers belonged somewhere else, to honesty, choice, communication, boundaries, courage, and time. And suddenly your soulmate understood something they had spent far too long avoiding. They had been waiting for an external event to give them permission to become emotionally honest. They had wanted a sign powerful enough to remove every uncertainty. They had imagined that one day circumstances would align perfectly and they would know exactly what to do. But now they could see that courage rarely arrives after uncertainty disappears. Courage is what people choose while uncertainty still exists. Their phone remained in their hand. The unfinished message waited. They returned to it. This time, they did not delete the first sentence. They added another. Then another. And another. The words began arriving faster, as though a locked door inside them had finally opened. They admitted that they had thought about you more than they ever confessed. They admitted that there had been moments when they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves silence was safer. They admitted that they had wondered whether you still remembered them with tenderness or whether their hesitation had changed the way you saw them forever. Then they stopped. Because another memory had surfaced. A memory involving you that they had never told anyone about. It was not necessarily the most dramatic moment between you. In fact, someone watching from the outside might have considered it ordinary. But your soulmate remembered it differently. They remembered a moment when you looked at them and somehow seemed to recognize the emotion they were trying to hide. You did not force them to explain. You did not demand that they reveal themselves. You simply remained present. That memory had followed them. At the time, they did not understand why. Now they did. They had spent much of their life believing love was supposed to be proven through intensity, dramatic promises, or constant reassurance. Yet something about your presence had shown them another possibility. Being truly seen could feel quieter than that. Sometimes it appeared in the way someone listened. Sometimes in the way they remembered a detail everyone else overlooked. Sometimes in the way they allowed silence without turning it into punishment. That was part of what frightened them. Because being admired is easy compared with being known. Admiration allows a person to maintain an image. Being known threatens the image and asks for the real person underneath. And you had come closer to that real person than they expected. They remembered pulling away emotionally after moments when the connection became especially genuine. You may have interpreted that behavior as inconsistency. Perhaps you wondered why warmth could suddenly become distance, why openness could suddenly become silence, why a person who appeared emotionally present could retreat without explanation. They had wondered the same thing about themselves. Now the answer was becoming clearer. Closeness had awakened vulnerability. Vulnerability had awakened fear. And fear had disguised itself as distance. But this waiting period surrounding the medical report had disrupted that cycle. For once, they could not distract themselves indefinitely. Life had placed them in a space where they were forced to sit with uncertainty, and uncertainty had exposed everything they had been using certainty to avoid. Then someone called them. It was the same person who had previously asked whether they intended to tell you the truth. Your soulmate hesitated before answering. When they finally did, the voice on the other end immediately sensed something had changed. Did you see it? Yes. Are you okay? There was another pause. I'm going to speak with the doctor about anything I don't understand. The answer was calm, responsible, grounded. Then the other person asked the question your soulmate knew was coming. And what about the other thing? Your soulmate knew exactly what they meant. The message. You. For the first time, they did not avoid the question. I'm writing it. There was silence on the other end. Then the person said something your soulmate had not expected. Don't write because you're scared. Write because you finally want to be truthful. Those words changed the entire direction of the message. Your soulmate looked down at what they had written and realized some sentences were being driven by emotion in the moment. They did not want to place responsibility for their fear onto you. They did not want you to receive a message that made you feel obligated to rescue them, reassure them, or immediately return their feelings. If they were finally going to speak, they wanted to speak with respect. So they rewrote parts of it. And that is where something beautiful began happening. The message became less dramatic and more honest. They wrote that they had no right to assume where you stood now. They wrote that they respected whatever boundaries or changes had entered your life. They wrote that they were not contacting you to demand an answer. But they also wrote that remaining silent had begun to feel dishonest. Then came the sentence they had been resisting. You mattered to me more than I knew how to handle. They read it once. Twice. 3 times. They almost deleted it. But they didn't. My child, notice what has changed. Earlier, they were afraid of the strength of their feelings. Now they were learning that admitting a feeling does not require controlling the outcome. Love does not become mature because someone feels intensely. It becomes mature when honesty can exist beside respect. That lesson had taken them longer than they wanted to admit. And perhaps your own journey has contained a similar lesson. Maybe you once believed that if this person truly cared, everything should have happened easily. Maybe their silence made you question your worth. Maybe you tried to decode every absence, every delay, every unexpected shift. But another person's emotional readiness is not a measurement of your value. Someone can care deeply and still be unprepared. Someone can feel something genuine and still make poor choices. Someone can miss you and still not know how to build something healthy. That is why the next part of this story matters so much. Your soulmate was no longer asking only, "Do I feel something?" They were asking, "Am I prepared to behave differently because of what I feel?" That question separates fantasy from transformation. They put the phone down and walked toward a window. Outside, the world looked completely ordinary. People were continuing their routines. Vehicles moved. Lights changed. Somewhere someone was laughing. Somewhere someone was beginning a new relationship. Somewhere someone was ending one. Somewhere someone was receiving good news, while somewhere else another person was learning to adapt to difficult news. Life was moving. And suddenly your soulmate realized how much time they had spent standing emotionally still. They thought about you again. But this time, instead of remembering only the beautiful moments, they remembered the moments when they had hurt you through uncertainty. That part was harder. They remembered times when you deserved clarity and received confusion. Moments when they could have communicated but chose silence. Moments when pride became more important than understanding. They remembered how easily someone can convince themselves they are protecting another person when they are actually protecting themselves from an uncomfortable conversation. They felt regret. But something inside them refused to let regret become self-punishment. Regret could either become another place to hide or a reason to change. They chose change. They returned to the message. "I cannot undo the moments when I should have spoken and didn't," they wrote. "But I can stop pretending those moments meant nothing to me." Their finger hovered above the screen. The send button was there. One movement. That was all it would take. But they still did not press it. Because there was one truth missing. The biggest one. The truth about why they believed your connection had entered their life in the first place. They had never been able to explain it logically. There were other people they could have met. Other paths they could have taken. Other circumstances that might have made everything easier. Yet something about knowing you had become a dividing line in their emotional life. There was the person they were before they understood what this connection awakened, and the person they became afterward. Before you, they could hide from certain parts of themselves. After you, hiding became harder. You reflected something back to them. Not perfection. Not destiny written in stone. Something more challenging. Possibility. The possibility that they could become emotionally braver. The possibility that love did not have to look like the patterns they had witnessed before. The possibility that someone could matter without being possessed. The possibility that vulnerability might not be weakness. That was why your presence had unsettled them. You represented a version of their life that required growth. And growth is frightening when a person has built safety around familiar patterns. They began typing again. "I think meeting you showed me something about myself I wasn't ready to see." Their heart beat faster. They continued. "I thought losing control was the thing I feared. Now I think I was afraid of becoming someone who could no longer hide behind control." They stopped. That was it. That was the deepest truth. Not the report. Not the uncertainty. Not even the distance. Control. Your soulmate had spent years trying to control how much people could see, how much they could feel, how much emotional risk they would allow. But real connection had entered a place that control could not completely reach. They had tried to contain it. Silence had not contained it. Distance had not contained it. Distraction had not contained it. Time had changed its shape, but it had not erased the lesson. And now they were beginning to understand why. The purpose of a meaningful connection is not always to give people immediate comfort. Sometimes it exposes the walls they have mistaken for protection. Your soulmate had built walls. You had built some too. Both of you had reasons. Both of you had histories. Both of you had fears you may never have fully explained. Yet somewhere between those walls, something genuine had been experienced. Whether that connection eventually becomes reconciliation, closure, friendship, renewed love, or simply a lesson carried forward, it deserves honesty rather than fantasy. And your soulmate was finally approaching that honesty. Then another unexpected thing happened. The person who had been supporting them sent a message. Just 4 words. Tell them the whole truth. Your soulmate stared at it. The whole truth. They had written about fear, they had written about regret. They had written about your importance. But there was still one thing they had not written. Something that had happened recently. Something connected to a conversation you knew nothing about. Several days before the medical appointment, your soulmate had been sitting with someone who knew pieces of your story. Your name had come up unexpectedly. Your soulmate initially tried to change the subject, but the other person refused to let the moment pass. They asked, "Why do you react differently whenever that person is mentioned?" Your soulmate laughed it off. The person did not laugh. They asked again. "What happened between you two?" Your soulmate gave the simplified version. Wrong timing. Misunderstandings. Life. Distance. But the person listening shook their head. "That's not what I asked." Your soulmate became quiet. The person leaned closer. "I asked what happened between you two, not what separated you." That distinction struck somewhere deep. Because your soulmate had spent so long explaining the ending that they had almost forgotten to explain the beginning. So they did. They spoke about how unexpectedly you entered their emotional world. They described the moments that felt different. They admitted that certain conversations stayed with them. They spoke about the strange combination of comfort and nervousness they experienced around you. The person listened carefully. Then they asked one question. "Did you love them?" Your soulmate froze. There are questions people answer with words. And there are questions the body answers before the mouth can. Their eyes changed. Their shoulders dropped. Their breathing slowed. The person sitting across from them already knew. But they waited anyway. Your soulmate eventually whispered, "I don't know what word I was ready to use then." The person asked, "And now?" Another silence. Then your soulmate said something they had never said aloud before. "Now I know I was more afraid of losing them than I ever admitted." That confession had happened before the report. Before the waiting. before this night. Meaning the emotions were not created by medical uncertainty. The uncertainty merely removed the final excuses. Your soulmate now understood this. And that was why they knew the message could not be written as though fear had suddenly produced love. It had only exposed what had already been unresolved. They added another sentence. I don't want this moment to manipulate you into feeling anything. I only want to stop hiding what was true for me. That sentence mattered. Because love without freedom becomes pressure. But love expressed honestly while respecting another person's choice becomes something different. Your soulmate was finally learning the difference. Then they looked again at the report notification. They knew they would follow up appropriately and not interpret medical information through fear or superstition. Yet something about seeing their own name beside clinical language had reminded them how human they were. How temporary every season is. How quickly years move. How many words remain unsaid because people assume there will always be another opportunity. That thought brought them back to you. Not because they believed anything terrible was about to happen, but because they realized they no longer wanted fear deciding which conversations they were allowed to have. They returned to your message. It was long now. Perhaps too long. They began shortening it. Removing anything that sounded like pressure. Removing anything that sounded like a prediction. Removing anything that asked you to fix their emotions. What remained was simpler. More vulnerable. More real. They wanted to tell you that you mattered. They wanted to acknowledge where they had failed. They wanted to respect where you might be now. And they wanted to ask whether there was room for one honest conversation. Nothing more. No demand for forever. No promise written by the stars. Just one conversation. One doorway. One chance for truth to exist where silence had lived. Their thumb moved toward send. Then stopped. A memory flashed across their mind. Something you had once said. They had not understood its importance when you said it. Now the words returned with startling clarity. You had told them, in your own way, that honesty mattered more to you than perfection. At the time, they thought they understood. They didn't. Now they did. You had never needed them to arrive without fear. You needed them to stop making fear your responsibility. Their eyes filled again. They whispered, I understand now. Then they pressed the screen. The message disappeared from the draft. For one terrifying second, your soulmate thought they had accidentally deleted it. Their heart jumped. They checked. And froze. Because the message had not been deleted. It had been sent. There it was. Delivered. Your name above it. Everything they had been avoiding was suddenly outside their control. They could no longer edit it. Could no longer retrieve it. Could no longer hide behind, maybe someday. They had spoken. And for the first few seconds, panic rushed through them. What did I just do? They stood. Sat again. Put the phone down. Picked it back up. No response. They told themselves not to stare at the screen. 10 seconds later, they stared again. Still nothing. Minutes began feeling longer than they should. But something strange happened underneath the anxiety. Relief. Not because they knew what you would say. They didn't. Not because they knew what the future held. They couldn't. They felt relief because, for once, their actions were aligned with the truth they had been carrying. Whatever happened next, silence was no longer speaking for them. And my child, perhaps this is the message hidden inside everything you have heard. Sometimes the breakthrough is not getting the outcome you imagined. Sometimes the breakthrough is finally becoming honest enough to face whatever outcome is real. Your soulmate had reached that point. But you had not seen the message yet. At least, they believed you hadn't. They watched the screen. Nothing changed. Then their phone rang. Not from you. It was the medical office. Your soulmate answered. The conversation was calm but important. There was something in the report that needed clarification. Not necessarily something catastrophic, not something this story will irresponsibly diagnose, but something that required a proper conversation with a medical professional. An appointment would be arranged. Questions would be answered. Facts would replace assumptions. Your soulmate thanked them and ended the call. For a moment, they sat silently. Then they looked back at your message. Still delivered. Still unanswered. And suddenly they smiled. A small, exhausted smile. Because they realized something profound. They could face one truth with a doctor. And another truth with you. Neither required panic. Both required courage. They closed their eyes. For the first time in days, their breathing slowed. They were not asking heaven to control your answer. They were not demanding a miracle. They simply whispered, "Whatever happens, help me meet it honestly." And that is when the screen lit up. Your soulmate opened their eyes. Their entire expression changed. Because beneath the message they had sent you, one small word had appeared. Read. You had seen it. Their heart began pounding. Seconds passed. No reply. Then the typing indicator appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared again. Your soulmate stared at the screen, barely breathing. You were writing something. Then stopping. Writing again. Whatever you were about to send was clearly not a casual response. Finally, the typing indicator vanished. A message arrived. Your soulmate looked at the first line. And what you had written caused them to sit completely still, because your response revealed that while they had been carrying this secret alone, there was something you had never told them either. And the moment they read your next sentence, they realized this connection had been misunderstood from both sides for far longer than either of you knew.